Hey, this is Writers Row. I'm DC Wright-Hammer, and I brought CD Tavner back. This time we're talking superheroes. Are they science fiction, science fantasy, more fantasy than science fiction? So I wanted to bring CD on. We did an episode about science fiction, science and fantasy. Let's talk about this. So there's the craze in the Marvel universe now. DC. I just got finished watching all of those movies, and there's a big distinction. Marvel's not great, but looks really good compared to DC. But this craze, like, people don't really understand. Like, this is science fantasy. I mean, it's on Star Wars-esque type things that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I almost want to just show stop and be like, superheroes are fantasy and the episode, but I think it's a lot more nuanced and detailed than that. And I think we talked about in the last episode on science fiction and fantasy all about the concept of the modern myth, and I think that the superhero craze is very much leaning into that idea of the modern myth. I think The Boys, the superhero show on Amazon, very much leans into this, with one of the characters essentially thinking he's a god. And like, it's getting at that idea of, what if there were people who were like essentially omnipotent individuals, which is what we saw in Greek mythology and Roman mythology all the time. And I think that's what makes it truly fantasy, is that it's this idea of, what if we could have power, crazy things, and how would a human react to having all of those powers?
Well, and the plot issues that come into these stories, where you have these unstoppable forces like Superman, like the Hulk, and in The Boys, forgetting his name, but the guy that's like Superman, basically.
Evangelical Superman.
Yeah, essentially blonde Superman. They're unstoppable. So you can't have them just be unstoppable. That becomes this, like, unentertaining story that they can do whatever they want, and that sounds fun in theory, but it quickly runs its course. And so you really have to have good storytelling. You have to have good supportive characters. I mean, in Marvel, they just sent the Hulk away for like a dozen movies, and then finally brought him back. And when they brought him back, he was only Hulk for like a movie and a half, and then he was not quite Hulk anymore. And then in the DC, they killed off Superman, so you could see these sort of average normie superheroes like struggle until he comes back and he's all powerful. But those, again, you are mixing that science and the fantasy. You're mixing sort of these godlike beings with the rest of us, and it really is like, oh, if Superman is stronger than all the other superheroes, and I'm not even as strong as a normal superhero, then, oh, I'm just an innocent bystander. What am I going to do?
Yeah, I think that the superhero genre itself captivates people and has captivated audiences. I mean, honestly, I think the first superhero comic, we're talking like the 30s. Like, Superman was like 37, maybe? Something like that. Around there. You just have this idea of what if someone had these powerful abilities to save us all. And I think we like having heroes. We like having people who are noble and like able to do these things. And I think that's why Superman is the first hero that was created, where he's almost like morally perfect, I think, is the way that he's like very much described in a lot of the original comics. It gets at this ideal. Now, I think one of the really cool things about the modern superhero genre, and they've done this over the course of these like 70 years, is they've really complicated that and created, dynamic heroes that are struggling with the very real things that other humans go through, in really good ways. But I think that at its core, though, is that in that moment when you've got this hero that has this motivation to do good, you really want that person to win, even if they make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think draws people to these sorts of narratives.
Well, and I think we want a hero that can save the day, and has all the powers necessary to protect us. There's the God aspect of it, somewhat parental. There's this like parental aspect to it where it's like, when we're kids, our parents are basically superheroes. They have all the knowledge, they do all the things for us, they know how the world works, and we sort of want that entity above us. But then it starts to sort of make our minds ask the question, if there are people who have those kind of powers for good, there might be people or beings with those kind of powers who are not so good. Or maybe they're good, their idea of good is different from our idea of good, and that creates conflict. And I think the idea of the supervillain, again, not just taking fantasies that make us feel better and try to explain the world, but fantasies that, even science fantasies with these superheroes that make us worry about the world and the consequences of our actions and things like that. I think it's really cool to see that dynamic.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I agree with all that. But and now as you were talking, I was thinking about the dangers of the superhero genre.
Mm-hmm.
And the dangers of hero worship in general, I think, right. And idolization. And I think one of the things why I think one of the ways I want to see the superhero genre go in the future is really, really thinking about the question that we are faced with in reality, which is we don't have singular heroes who can save the world.
Right.
We actually, many of the problems that we face as a planet require like everyone to be engaging in some meaningful way, or a significant portion of people to be engaging in some way. And it would be interesting to see the superhero genre try to engage with that question in some fascinating ways where, and I think that's where the superhero genres that really get into like lots of people having abilities, it kind of almost becomes like a democratic superhero thing. And Marvel kind of does this with the Avengers a little bit, but they're like X-Men, the X-Men setting, which is in the Marvel setting, but in the film world, they've been kind of separate from now on, is that like there are lots of people getting powers. And what does that look like when you've got this widespread experience, and how you face down good and evil, questions of good and evil, when you've got lots of people in the fight.
Right. Well, and I think, look, I'm not going to argue that MCU is like great storytelling, but I think it's more of a roller coaster ride that has a lot of fun characters. It's fun. It's just kind of good, solid, just fun and, entertainment in that sense. But I think where they did get it right was that they did expand it. They didn't make it about, we need this one hero to do this one thing. In the end, if you watch Infinity Wars, they failed, spoiler alert. And if you go to Endgame, it took everyone working together, coming up with this crazy plan that could fail, and they all had to tap into their powers, even the ones that don't necessarily have superpowers that were helping out. And, it came to this epic conclusion. And I think as writers, if we're writing superheroes or people with special abilities like that, I think it's important for us to understand that, you got to have something that engages the viewer if it's a movie, or your readers, if, that they can connect to these beings, these humans with special powers or whatever it is, because otherwise you're just writing, I sling my power at this person, they sling their power back at me, and it's not engaging in that way. You've got to have that thing that pulls the reader in and makes them actually care.
So we've talked a lot about the human experience, hero worship, hero, like anti-heroes, or we haven't actually used that term, but like the concept of like the complicated hero. Sure. Inspirational story of like in Endgame, where the whole big battle, everyone comes out of the portals and stuff like that. Right. And we haven't talked at all about like technology, right, experience of humans interacting with science. And that's why I think, based on this entire discussion, I'm going to return to my comment that I think superhero genre is fundamentally fantasy. Right. Because any superhero story that has science trappings is using that as a vehicle to create something fantastical and omnipotent in some cases. And right. I think, and then getting at these other questions. And that's why I think it's fundamentally fantasy, but you might disagree with me.
Well, so there's a science aspect to much of it, right? So let's just, I want you to put a percentage on it, and then I'll put a percentage on it. How much of the superhero genre is science versus fantasy?
10% science, 90% fantasy.
Really? That's somewhat of a hot take. I'm going to have to put a link to you saying that in the description so people can see that. So 90% fantasy. I'm going to short up a little bit. I'm going to say 25% science, 75% fantasy. And I say that only because a lot of it is futuristic. A lot of it is next level, like what's the next step in science. I understand where you're coming from, though, and I think that sort of is like people think they're watching science fiction, but it totally is fantastical, and that's really cool. So,
I mean, one of the reasons for me is they don't explain anything. Like science fiction, like it really, like they just like, hey, there's this particle that does this thing, and it's just like completely made up. It's like a magic system.
Right, and like, but they do it enough. Right? They do it enough. There's the gamma rays that the Hulk got. Superman's allergic to kryptonite from his planet. They do it enough to help you suspend that disbelief, and then they just move right along, and then often make up new rules. But
it's the green spirit magic that makes the Hulk omnipotent. It's the green crystals that make Superman weak. That's why I'm saying, like, you could literally describe it in like. Yeah, fantastic. It's they took a sciencey term and applied it to something that is completely that's where but I think that's why they make it relatable through these realistic terms that we know, and that's why the superhero genre becomes so captivating to people.
Yep. Yeah. Again, not writing to write home about, but not everything has to be the super philosophical, deep, thing, but I just think it's interesting because people, they're like, oh, this is science fiction, this is like great, and it does seem to be so much more fantastical. Really appreciate the conversation, CD. Glad you've been able to make it on the show more often, and we will definitely catch you all next time. Thanks for watching.